What if I told you that a 25-year-old activist completely changed how Nepal's most powerful judge thought about justice? This is the incredible true story of how Anjana Maharjan, a fearless women's rights activist, walked into Chief Justice Sushila Karki's courtroom and challenged everything she believed about the law. What happened next didn't just change two lives, it transformed an entire country's approach to women's rights. It was a scorching hot day in July 2017 when Anjana Maharjan burst through the doors of the Supreme Court building in Kathmandu. At just 25 years old, she had already spent 3 years fighting for women's rights in Nepal's rural villages, documenting cases of domestic violence, forced marriages, and legal discrimination that most people preferred to ignore. But this wasn't a planned visit. Anjana was furious, desperate, and carrying a folder full of evidence that she believed would shock even the country's chief justice. She had tried every legal channel, contacted every women's rights organization, and appealed to local authorities. Nothing had worked. Now she was taking her fight directly to the top. The security guards at the Supreme Court weren't used to young women demanding to see the Chief Justice immediately. "Ma'am, you need an appointment," they explained patiently. "Chief Justice Karki doesn't see anyone without proper scheduling." "Then schedule me right now," Anjana replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "Because if she doesn't see me today, 3 more women will die this week, and their blood will be on all our hands." Word of the passionate young woman in the lobby eventually reached Sushila Karki's chambers. The Chief Justice had been reviewing routine case files, but something about the situation intrigued her. In her decades on the bench, she had seen thousands of lawyers, activists, and petitioners, but few had ever demanded to see her with such urgency. "Send her up," Sushila told her secretary, "but give her only 10 minutes. I have important constitutional matters to review." Neither woman knew that this 10-minute meeting would stretch into 3 hours and change both of their lives forever. When Anjana walked into the Chief Justice's chamber, she was struck by how small and ordinary the room looked. She had expected something grand and intimidating, but instead found a modest office with law books, family photos, and a woman who looked more like someone's grandmother than the most powerful judge in Nepal. But Sushila Karki's eyes were sharp and assessing as she studied the young woman in front of her. "You have 10 minutes. Make them count." What Anjana said next would shatter everything Sushila thought she knew about justice in Nepal. Anjana opened her folder with trembling hands and placed a photograph on Sushila's desk. It showed a young woman, barely 18, with bruises covering her face and arms. This is Kamala Tamang from Sindhu Palchok district. She was beaten by her husband every day for 6 months because she couldn't produce a male child. Sushila looked at the photo, her expression remaining professional. She had seen domestic violence cases before. "This is terrible, but domestic violence cases should go through district courts first. Why are you bringing this to me?" "Because," Anjana replied, placing another photo on the desk. When Kamala finally gathered the courage to report her husband to the local police, they laughed at her. They told her that beating wives was normal and that she should try harder to have a son. The second photo showed the same woman, but this time she was in a hospital bed connected to multiple machines. When she tried to leave her husband, he poured acid on her face. She's been in a coma for 2 weeks. Sushila's professional composure began to crack slightly. "This is horrific. But what do you expect me to do? I can't intervene in every domestic violence case in Nepal." Anjana leaned forward, her voice rising with passion. "With respect, Chief Justice, this isn't just about one case. I have documented 847 similar cases in the past year alone. Women who were turned away by police, dismissed by local courts, and abandoned by a legal system that treats them as property rather than people." She began placing document after document on Sushila's desk. Police reports that were never filed, court cases that were dismissed without investigation, medical records showing patterns of systematic abuse. "The laws you've helped create are beautiful on paper, but they're meaningless if they're not enforced." For the first time in the meeting, Sushila was speechless. In her decades as a judge, she had focused on high-level constitutional issues, corruption cases, and judicial reform. She had always believed that if the laws were sound, justice would follow. But the evidence spread across her desk told a different story. "Ma'am," Anjana said, her voice breaking slightly, "I'm not here to criticize you. I'm here because you're the only person in this country with the power to actually change this. These women need someone who understands what it's like to fight for justice in a world that doesn't want to listen to women." Sushila looked up from the documents, and for the first time, she really saw the young woman sitting across from her. Anjana's clothes were worn from traveling to remote villages. Her hands were calloused from manual work. Her eyes held a fire that reminded Sushila of her own younger self, fighting to be taken seriously in law school. "How old are you?" Sushila asked quietly. 25, ma'am." "The same age I was when I won my first major case," Sushila murmured, almost to herself. She had been so focused on reaching the top of the judicial system that she had perhaps lost sight of the people at the bottom who needed that system to work for them. Before you hear what happened next, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more incredible true stories. And let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers around the world. What Chief Justice Sushila Karki did next would shock the entire legal establishment and create a new model for justice in Nepal. Sushila Karki stood up from her desk and walked to the window overlooking Kathmandu. For several minutes, she said nothing while Anjana waited nervously, wondering if she had pushed too hard, said too much, or offended the most powerful judge in Nepal. Finally, Sushila turned around. "Anjana, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think I've failed these women?" The question hung in the air between them. Anjana had expected anger, dismissal, or bureaucratic explanations. She hadn't expected vulnerability from someone she had seen as untouchable. "Ma'am," Anjana replied carefully, "I don't think you've failed anyone, but I think the system has failed, and you have the power to fix it in ways that people like me never could." Sushila nodded slowly. "You know, when I became Chief Justice, I thought my job was to interpret the law, ensure judicial independence, and handle constitutional matters. I never considered that the law I was interpreting might be meaningless if it couldn't protect an 18-year-old girl in Sindhu Pelchuk." She returned to her desk and began studying the documents more carefully, asking Anjana detailed questions about each case, the local legal procedures, and the systematic failures she had observed. What was supposed to be a 10-minute meeting stretched into its second hour. "What do you propose we do?" Sushila asked finally. Anjana took a deep breath. She had dreamed of this moment, but never actually expected it to happen. "I propose we create a special judicial mechanism, mobile courts that go directly to rural areas where women can report crimes without fear. I propose mandatory training for all police officers on women's rights laws, and I propose that domestic violence cases get fast-track processing in all courts." "Those are significant systemic changes," Sushila pointed out. "They would require cooperation from multiple government agencies, additional funding, and probably new legislation." "Yes, ma'am, they would." "And you think a 25-year-old activist and a 65-year-old Chief Justice can make all of that happen?" "I think," Anjana said with quiet determination, "that if we don't try, then we're complicit in every woman who suffers because the system failed her." Something shifted in Sushila's expression. The careful judicial neutrality was replaced with something that looked like the fierce determination that had carried her through decades of legal battles. "All right, Anjana Maharjan, you've convinced me. But if we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly." What happened over the next 6 months would create the most comprehensive women's rights judicial reform in South Asian history. But first, Sushila had to deal with the massive resistance from within her own judicial system.
The announcement that Chief Justice Karki was partnering with a young activist to reform women's rights enforcement sent shockwaves through Nepal's legal establishment. Senior judges questioned her judgment, government officials worried about the cost and complexity of her proposals, and conservative groups accused her of overstepping her judicial role. But Sushila had made her decision. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just interpreting the law, she was fighting to make sure it actually worked for the people who needed it most.
The transformation that followed was nothing short of revolutionary. Within 6 months of their first meeting, Sushila Karki and Anjana Maharjan had accomplished what many thought was impossible. They established Nepal's first mobile court system specifically for women's rights cases, created mandatory sensitivity training for law enforcement, and implemented a fast-track legal process for domestic violence cases. But the real change went deeper than policy reforms. Sushila had begun visiting rural districts personally, something no Chief Justice had ever done before. She would arrive unannounced at local courts, review how women's cases were being handled, and hold impromptu training sessions for local judges and police officers. During one such visit to Sindupalchok district, the same area where Kamala Tamang had been attacked, Sushila witnessed something that would stay with her forever. A young woman, barely 20, approached the mobile court with her infant son, seeking protection from an abusive husband. Instead of being dismissed or told to return with proper paperwork, she was heard, believed, and immediately provided with legal protection. "This is what justice looks like," Anjana whispered to Sushila as they watched the woman leave with legal documents that would keep her safe. "No," Sushila replied quietly. "This is what justice should have always looked like. You showed me the difference." The impact of their partnership extended far beyond Nepal's borders. International women's rights organizations began studying the Karki-Maharjan model as an example of how judicial systems could proactively protect vulnerable populations rather than simply react to crimes after they occurred. But the real change went deeper than policy reforms. Sushila had begun visiting rural districts personally, something no Chief Justice had ever done before. She would arrive unannounced at local courts, review how women's cases were being handled, and hold impromptu training sessions for local judges and police officers. During one such visit to Sindupalchok district, the same area where Kamala Tamang had been attacked, Sushila witnessed something that would stay with her forever. A young woman, barely 20, approached the mobile court with her infant son, seeking protection from an abusive husband. Instead of being dismissed or told to return with proper paperwork, she was heard, believed, and immediately provided with legal protection. "This is what justice looks like," Anjana whispered to Sushila, as they watched the woman leave with legal documents that would keep her safe. "No," Sushila replied quietly. "This is what justice should have always looked like. You showed me the difference." The impact of their partnership extended far beyond Nepal's borders. International women's rights organizations began studying the Karki-Maharjan model as an example of how judicial systems could proactively protect vulnerable populations rather than simply react to crimes after they occurred. But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationship between the two women themselves. Sushila, who had spent decades as a solitary figure focused on high-level legal matters, discovered the fulfillment that came from direct impact on ordinary people's lives. Anjana, who had been fighting alone with limited resources, gained access to systemic power that could multiply her impact exponentially. Their monthly meetings became legendary within Nepal's legal community. The Chief Justice and the young activist would spend hours reviewing cases, developing new policies, and strategizing about how to overcome resistance to their reforms. 1 year after their first meeting, Sushila stood before Nepal's Judicial Council to deliver her annual report. Instead of the usual statistics about case processing and administrative efficiency, she began with a story about Kamala Tamang, who had not only survived her attack, but had become a local women's rights advocate herself. "This year," Sushila told her fellow judges, "we didn't just process cases.
we changed lives. We didn't just interpret laws, we made them meaningful. And we learned that sometimes the most important teacher a Chief Justice can have is a 25-year-old activist who refuses to accept that suffering is inevitable. If you enjoyed this powerful story about mentorship, courage, and systemic change, please subscribe and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support means everything to me. The reforms that Sushila Karki and Anjana Maharjan implemented are still in effect today, and domestic violence prosecution rates in Nepal have increased by over 400% since their partnership began. But more importantly, they proved that real change happens when different generations work together, when experience meets passion, when power meets purpose, and when two women decide that the status quo simply isn't good enough. Anjana Maharjan is now 32 years old and serves as Nepal's Director of Women's Legal Aid. She still meets monthly with Sushila Karki, though now it's often the older women asking the younger one for advice on how to make the justice system even more responsive to those who need it most. The activist who walked into that courtroom to change the Chief Justice's mind ended up discovering that sometimes the most powerful people are just waiting for someone brave enough to show them a better way forward.